It began with the universe's worst light switch. 1 second Earth buzzed in neon and electricity, skyscrapers pulsing, highways humming with headlights, phones glowing like handheld suns. The next, it all died in an instant, every bulb, every screen, every flicker of flame snuffed out as if the cosmos itself had drawn a deep breath and decided it was done with light. The blackout was so sudden that New York, Tokyo, London, and every small town in between screamed in collective confusion. Drivers slammed into each other. Night shift workers cursed and fumbled for flashlights that would not work. And somewhere in orbit above Earth, an alien commander laughed, congratulating himself for the simplest yet most effective victory in galactic history. To him, humans were stumbling infants, creatures who only felt safe when their world glowed. He did not know what lurked in the pitch black he had gifted them. He had no idea that darkness on Earth belonged to others. The first few minutes were chaos. A man in Los Angeles tripped over his coffee table and shouted at his wife for moving it, though she had not. In Mumbai, children screamed when their nightlight blinked out, and their parents screamed louder when the entire city followed. A grandmother in Mexico City insisted the blackout was because her grandson had been playing too many video games, and she smacked him over the head in the dark. All around the world, people panicked, cursed, laughed nervously, and bumped their shins against the merciless sharp edges of furniture. But beneath the comedy of clumsy humans was a rising tide of fear. Hospitals lost power. Planes disappeared from radar. Emergency lines were jammed. The world was blind. Meanwhile, the alien command ship hovered in silence, its officers peering at maps of a suddenly quiet planet. The commander poured himself a glass of blue liquid and raised it like a toast. "Humans are undone," he declared in his strange, crackling tone. "Their weakness is revealed. They cannot function without their precious light." His officers nodded, eager for praise. Somewhere in the shadows of his ship, however, an older officer frowned. He had studied Earth longer than the others. He had heard stories that were not in the official records. But when he tried to speak, the commander silenced him with a wave. "Old myths," he said, "are not worth consideration. Myths do not win wars." And so he dismissed the warning, believing the dark had made Earth defenseless. Down on the surface, people were discovering otherwise. A young man in Chicago, stumbling toward what he thought was his front door, froze when two glowing eyes appeared in the alley. At first he thought it was a cat, but then the eyes rose taller than a man. Cloaked in shadows, the figure moved with a grace that was not human. The young man gasped, backpedaled, and smacked into a garbage can, sending it clattering. The figure tilted its head, studied him, then whispered in a low rumble, "Be still." He wanted to scream, but the scream caught in his throat when the figure vanished in a blur of movement and reappeared behind an alien scout that had been sneaking up the street. The alien never made a sound. One moment it was standing there, the next it was collapsing, throat cut by something unseen. The glowing-eyed figure turned back to the man, who promptly fainted face first into the trash. The figure sighed. Humans always make things complicated. Across the globe, similar encounters played out. A girl in Cairo, clutching her grandmother's hand in the sudden dark, saw what she thought were shadows moving independently of the wind. In Sao Paulo, a group of teenagers trying to make jokes about the blackout fell silent when they realized the laughter behind them was not theirs. In a farmhouse outside Paris, an old man muttered under his breath, "It has been a long time," and then smiled knowingly when a tall figure appeared in his doorway. For centuries, the night wardens had hidden themselves, sworn to intervene only if Earth truly needed them. Their oath was old, older than nations, older than most religions. The aliens thought they had forced humanity into weakness. Instead, they had unlocked the one condition under which the Wardens could act without restraint. The first wave of alien scouts landed to take advantage of the blackout. They carried luminous blades and devices that crackled with energy. They assumed the darkness gave them superiority. They quickly discovered otherwise. In Moscow, a squad of aliens crept into an empty apartment block only to find themselves hunted from the rafters. In Sydney, another patrol heard whispers in the dark and fired blindly until nothing remained but their own echoes. In Nairobi, 2 aliens were found dangling upside down from a lamppost like trophies, though no human had climbed that high. The Wardens did not fight with brute force. They stalked. They laughed quietly in the dark. They made the invaders feel like prey, and that was far worse than death. Still, the humans were terrified. They did not understand who these strange allies were, or if they were allies at all. Rumors spread faster than the blackout itself. Some said the government had unleashed secret soldiers bred for darkness. Others claimed demons had risen with the night. Many prayed, some drank, a few danced wildly in the streets, insisting the apocalypse was a party. But in truth, no one knew. All they felt was the rising sensation that the dark was no longer theirs alone. The aliens began to notice too. Their first reports were filled with confusion. Targets missing. Scouts gone silent. Patrols not returning. The commander dismissed it at first as human incompetence. He laughed again, claiming the humans were too scared to fight. Yet with each passing hour, the reports grew stranger. Descriptions of creatures with glowing eyes. Shadows moving against the laws of physics. Laughter where no human could possibly be. Still, he refused to believe. He had already turned off the lights. In his mind, the battle was won. What force could thrive in total darkness? He would learn soon enough. In the city ruins, a doctor crouched behind an overturned ambulance, clutching a scalpel and shaking hands. She had seen the aliens and thought she was about to die. But then one of them dropped, its throat cut as if by invisible claws. A figure crouched beside her. Tall, cloaked, face hidden except for 2 faintly glowing eyes. She wanted to scream, but the figure pressed a finger to its lips. Do not fear. We are the Night Wardens. We hunt in the dark. For the first time since the blackout, she felt a flicker of hope. Somewhere above, the alien commander sipped his drink, smug and blind to the truth. His greatest weapon had just unleashed his worst nightmare. Would you like me to continue building Chapter 2 in the same detailed, dramatic flow, keeping the humor and high-stakes tone consistent? The dark settled like a second atmosphere, thicker than air and oddly alive, and the doctor who had crouched behind the ambulance found her hands steadier than before. The figure beside her introduced himself with a voice that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his chest. He called himself Var. He spoke with a patience that did not quite hide his impatience, as if every second spent explaining himself to a human was a second an alien did not get hunted. She asked the obvious question because it sat on her tongue like a stone. Are you on our side? He answered that the Night Wardens served the balance of this world and that for tonight the balance and the humans stood in the same place. It was not a marriage, he told her. It was a battlefield handshake. The doctor, whose name was Aya, decided that would have to do. She tucked the scalpel into her pocket, an absurd talisman, and followed him into the dark. He led her down a ramp into a service tunnel. She expected cold concrete. Instead, the corridor was warm, humming with a low vibration that had nothing to do with electricity. Var tapped a section of wall and a seam opened, admitting them to a place that should not have fit beneath a city street. The room was long and vaulted, ribbed like a cavern of bone, and nesting against its edges were dozens of figures like Var, some towering, some wiry, all cloaked. There was no light, yet Aya could see. Shapes resolved in shades beyond black, edges picked out by glow that seemed to come from the Wardens themselves. She registered details and forced herself not to flinch. Eyes that glowed not with menace, but with the quiet focus of artisans. Fingers that ended in nails too neat and too sharp to be accidental. Mouths that smiled sometimes, thinly, rarely, but real. The air smelled like rain on stone even though there had been no rain, and as Aya moved into the space she felt the strangest sensation of walking into an old story told by a grandparent who always winked at the scary parts. The Wardens were arming themselves with tools that were not weapons in any human sense. Coils of woven dark that clung to their wrists, and then vanished when they flexed. Hooks that appeared only when held at a certain angle. Sand in small leather pouches that whispered when poured into an open palm. She saw a Warden drop a pinch of that sand to the floor, and for a heartbeat the room was a forest of night trees and then it was stone again. There were no engines here, No hum of generators, no hiss of valves. Yet the room throbbed with readiness. Var conducted Aya to a half-circle where 3 wardens stood slightly elevated. The one in the center had a face so lined it looked carved. He studied Aya with interest, which seemed unfair because she could not see his eyes beneath his hood the way she could with the others. He announced that she had been brought under the veil, and that meant she shared responsibility. Aya said she was a doctor and responsibility was already her second spine. The one to the left of the elder snorted. That was probably Kesh, Var whispered. Kesh had the attitude of a soldier who had been told to file reports, and he wore his sarcasm like armor. It gleamed even in the dark. He asked Var if he had brought a scalpel to a hunt. Var said he had brought a human who could stitch a warden back together if the hunt went badly. That quieted the room. Aya felt something like approval wash over her, unexpected and heavy, and it made her stand taller. Beyond this chamber other doors opened and closed, admitting groups of people who had stumbled into the warden network by accident or design. A bus driver who had shepherded a load of children across a city gone sightless. A grocer who knew the layout of every back alley in 3 districts. A pair of electric utility workers whose skills were suddenly useless and yet not, because they understood how cities were built and where things hid. They arrived in 2s and 10s, blinking at the impossible architecture, clutching each other, then slowly being peeled apart by warden hands and warden voices, given tasks that made sense in the dark. It struck Aya that the wardens had been preparing for this for a very long time. Not because they had wanted it, but because the night was their duty, and duty was a long road with no rest stops. A young warden stood at the edge of all this, like a shadow that could not decide whether to join the rest of the night. If the others flowed, this one hesitated. If they breathed evenly, this one caught breath the way Aya did after sprinting up hospital stairs. Var introduced them as Lyra, and Aya realized with a small shock that youth looked different in the dark. Lyra was slight, quick-eyed, and her glow was a fraction dimmer than the others, as if she had not yet learned to burn without consuming herself. When Var asked for Lyra to accompany him on a patrol, Lyra glanced toward the elder. The elder inclined his head, and that tiny motion held a world of expectation. Aya thought of the interns she had supervised and felt an immediate flare of sympathy. The wardens explained themselves in pieces while they worked, as if simple facts would help the humans stand steadier. They had been here as long as humans had told stories of things that watched from the edges of firelight. They kept oaths to one another and to the dark itself. The oath forbade them from revealing their presence unless the world crossed the threshold. A total hush of light made that threshold. The aliens had cut the first wire and unknowingly closed the last seal. Now the wardens were not only allowed to hunt. They were required to. Kesh muttered something about overtime again, and another warden swatted him lightly on the arm without looking. The gesture made Aya smile against her will. It made the monsters less monstrous and therefore more terrifying, because human warmth wrapped around claws. The first alien patrols swept into the cities with the casual arrogance of predators who had never known what it felt like to be hunted. Their boots clattered on pavement, their strange blades cast faint glimmers of artificial light, and their voices barked in sharp bursts of command. They expected screams, scattering crowds, and helpless prey. Instead they found silence, broken only by the sound of their own movements echoing far too loudly through empty streets. They were creatures built for domination, not subtlety. The blackout that was meant to cripple humans had instead tilted the battlefield against them. What they did not know was that every corner, every tunnel, and every rooftop had already become the ground of the night wardens. The aliens were stumbling through a hunting ground without realizing they had been demoted from predators to quarry. Aya followed Var and Lyra into the open air that had turned into something more like the deep belly of a cave. Above, clouds smothered the stars, leaving no sky, only black upon black. The faint glow of alien weapons moved like fireflies that did not belong to the natural world. Aya clutched her scalpel, a useless gesture but a grounding one, as Var whispered instructions. The aliens walk loudly because they believe it is intimidation, he said. In truth, it betrays them. Prey can always hear predators who think themselves invincible. Aya asked if she was considered prey. Lyra answered softly that she was no longer only prey if she chose not to be. Aya swallowed hard and decided to take that as encouragement rather than warning. The first clash came in the hollow skeleton of an abandoned subway station. Aliens had set up beacons along the platforms, devices that pulsed with a dull glow to keep the dark at bay. Humans hiding there cowered from the light instead of running to it. That was the first sign the Wardens had already been working. When the aliens scanned their surroundings, they found the walls scratched with patterns that seemed meaningless. To Aya, they looked like graffiti, the kind teenagers scrawled in alleyways. But when one alien turned his gaze away, one of the symbols flared faintly, and a shadow detached itself from the wall to pull him into the ceiling without a sound. The remaining aliens raised their weapons, but the sound of laughter echoed through the station, low, mocking, and impossible to place. It was Kesh, making sure they knew they were not alone. The battle unfolded less like combat, and more like a cruel game of hide and seek. The aliens lashed out with their glowing blades, slashing at empty air and hitting walls, sparks spitting. Wardens flickered in and out of sight, their presence known only by brief glows of eyes and the sudden collapse of another alien. Aya watched one warden leap from the shadows of a train car, landing on an alien's shoulders and twisting until the creature dropped in a boneless heap. Another warden whispered into the ear of an alien before sliding a hook across its chest, and the alien screamed so loudly it seemed the sound would break the world. The scream was cut off abruptly when the body fell still. Aya wanted to cover her ears, but Lyra steadied her hand without looking. "This is what hunting is," Lyra murmured. "The dark is not silence. It is music, if you know how to listen." Despite their confidence, the aliens were not without skill. One patrol leader activated a device that spilled harsh beams of synthetic light across the platform. For a moment Aya could see everything. The ruined posters on the walls, the shattered glass on the floor, the wardens caught in mid-motion like figures exposed by a flash of lightning. The sight of them was almost too much for Aya to bear. Their bodies were human but not. Too tall, too sleek, too fluid. Their eyes blazed brighter than ever, like the hearts of comets. But in that instant of exposure, the alien struck, and two wardens went down, their cloaks smoking where the light had touched them. Aya screamed despite herself and ran to one of them, pressing her hands against wounds that looked like burns and frost at the same time. The warden's blood was slow and reluctant, but it obeyed her firm hands. She stitched while chaos raged, feeling the thread tug at her soul. She told the warden not to die because she was not about to waste her best effort on a corpse. The warden actually smiled faintly at that. The wardens adapted. Var hurled a pouch of the whispering sand at the alien device. The beams of light bent, twisted, then shattered into nothing. Shadows rushed back and like a tide reclaiming the beach. The aliens blinked in confusion, suddenly robbed of sight, and in that blink they were torn down. Kesh laughed again, louder this time, as if to remind the aliens that humor was a weapon. He described them as clowns in armor, falling over their own arrogance. Aya caught herself laughing too, the sound sharp and cracked but real. It helped her breathe when the stench of alien blood tried to choke her. When the dust settled, the subway was once again a cavern of quiet. The beacons sputtered out one by one. Humans who had been hiding emerged hesitantly, their faces pale but their eyes bright with the realization that survival was possible. Some knelt before the wardens, mistaking them for angels or demons. The wardens corrected them with silence. They did not want worship. They wanted only the hunt. Var told Aya that worship is a chain, and wardens carry only weapons. She nodded, though she still felt awe tightening her chest. Word spread among the aliens of patrols that had gone missing. Reports piled up of scouts failing to return, of equipment sabotaged, of humans emboldened rather than broken. The alien commander received these reports with growing irritation, though he still dismissed them as incompetence. His officers urged him to reconsider, to account for what the old myths had whispered. He snarled that myths were bedtime stories, not battlefield intelligence. Yet his scowl deepened every time another patrol failed to check in. He ordered larger squads to move together, thinking numbers would solve the problem. He did not understand that numbers only made bigger targets. Rumors moved through the dark like wind through tall grass, bending and rising and bending again, and the wardens listened the way hunters listen to a forest they know by heartbeat. I learned the rhythm of those rumors, how they carried little truths like seeds. Patrols vanished near the archives beneath the old museum. An alien device hummed with a note that made warden eyes dim. A human voice had been heard speaking the alien tongue in an alley behind the council hall. Each tale seemed too strange alone, and yet together they formed a map that pointed toward a single place under the city where even the shadows kept their backs to the wall. Var said they would go at once and brought Kesh and Lyra. Aya insisted on coming, arguing that secrets often bled and she was the only one who could stitch them shut without leaving visible scars. Kesh said he adored people who volunteered for nightmares, and Var shook his head but did not refuse her. They reached the museum by a route that would have made no sense in daylight. Warden pathways slid between spaces, doors and alleys and doors, staircases that seemed to climb downward and floors that felt like ceilings underfoot. I tried not to think about it too much. The museum loomed as a darker shape against darkness, its columns like tree trunks in a forest that had forgotten how to grow. They did not enter through the grand steps. Var touched a patch of cracked wall and a thin seam clicked. A narrow passage carried them into air that smelled like old paper and the quiet pride of 1,000 careful hands. Aya had always loved museums. She used to visit on days off, breathing in the patience of centuries. Now she breathed in fear. Even the bronze statues felt as if they were watching with their eyes closed. Below the museum lay a vault no one had built, and yet it had been waiting. A hall of niches opened into a chamber ringed with urns. Not human urns, Aya thought at once. Too tall, too smooth, etched with compound curves that made the eyes slide aside. Each urn pulsed faintly as if it were asleep and dreaming of light. Kesh said he disliked vases with opinions and reached to poke one until Var caught his wrist. "Do not touch," Var murmured. "Not yet." Lyra drifted to the center of the room and tilted her head. She said the walls were humming at a frequency that made her teeth itch. Aya felt it too now, a pressure on the jaw as if the chamber were chewing slowly. Then the sound rose like a chorus of insects, and the lids of the urns slid aside. They did not hold ashes. They held memories carved into the air. The chamber flooded with ghostly scenes that unfolded without sound. A pale planet under a black sun. Laboratories of cold geometry. Figures shaped like wardens, not yet cloaked, not yet laughing, standing still in rows while taller beings adjusted the machines that caged them. Aya felt her stomach drop. The aliens had not just discovered Earth's darkness. They had prepared it. Var stood rigid, fists clenched, eyes burning so bright the urn light looked pale. Kesh, who joked as a reflex, could not find a line. Lyra pressed her hands flat to the air as if she could push the images away. The scenes shifted. The not yet wardens learned to move, to balance within shadow the way a musician finds rhythm in silence. Some broke apart in light, bodies kindling like paper. Some endured. The taller beings debated, their gestures clipped and precise. Then the view shifted to Earth's night, forests and caves and the undersides of bridges, and the shaped ones slipped into the world like water vanishing into ground. They were not guardians in those first days. They were tools meant to find something the taller beings could not see for themselves. Aya remembered the old officer's warning that myths were information and wanted to reach back in time to make the commander listen. The urns told the rest brutally. The shaped ones learned Earth the way patient hands learn an instrument, and found it to be music that did not belong to their makers. They rebelled without a war. They simply refused to point. They erased tracks, hid signatures, made dark into home rather than hiding place, and when their makers returned to collect, the shaped ones were already wardens and the night would not open for anyone else. The urns dimmed. Silence swelled, heavy as water. The second twist arrived not from the urns but from footsteps in the next chamber, a cadence too regular to be warden and too confident to be civilian. A human stepped into view holding an alien communicator that threw a weak oval of light over his face. He was a council member, a famous one, the kind who had been on television often enough that Aya had once watched him while brushing her teeth. He had the narrow gaze of a man who had never met a mirror that did not congratulate him. He blinked at the Wardens with practiced outrage that could not hide a tremor. He declared that Earth needed a deal and that he had the courage to make it. Kesh asked if he had also had the courage to read the part of the contract where humanity became inventory. The counselor said inventory was too harsh a word. He preferred assets. The aliens would leave Earth's infrastructure mostly intact, he said, if the Wardens were surrendered. Var's hands tightened again, and the air cooled 10 degrees. Aya stepped forward before any blade bared. She asked the counselor how many times in his career he had been certain he was the smartest person in the room. He smiled automatically and said often. Then she told him he had finally found a room where he was not even on the podium. He scoffed and waved the communicator, and the chamber reacted. The urns surged, their images flickering into new scenes of harvest. Wardens bound in light the way a moth is pinned, their eyes dim. Taller beings cut into the dark with angles that hurt to consider. The counselor blanched and set the device down so fast it clacked. He had not known it would trigger the vault. He had not known anything beyond his own ambition. Even Kesh could not joke just then. Lyra whispered that betrayal had a smell and now she would know it anywhere. The aliens arrived like a storm through a door that had masqueraded as a plain wall. A squad poured in, blades humming, armor gleaming with that hateful glow that made Warden eyes sting. The commander was not with them, but his orders rode ahead in their timing. Disable and contain. Seize the urns. Tag the Wardens. Kill only if it saves time. It unfolded fast. Var hurled sand that broke a beam and made it spill sideways into empty air. Kesh sprung a loop of woven dark that caught 2 aliens and slammed them together with a satisfying thud. Lyra darted under a blade and cut the strap of a device at an alien's hip so that it tumbled and sputtered itself into sleep. I had dragged the counselor behind a pillar when he tried to stand and speechify in the middle of combat, hissing that martyrdom made a terrible public service announcement. The night had reached a point where it felt permanent, a weight pressing on every roof and street, a shroud that even hope hesitated to pierce. I had thought often of morning, but morning had become a myth told to calm frightened children. The Wardens spoke of it rarely, and when they did their voices carried no expectation, only memory. They had decided the only way to break the aliens' hold was to make the darkness absolute, to strip every artificial glow from the world so that only the natural black remained. It sounded insane at first, but as Var explained, half measures left cracks and cracks became traps. The aliens were beginning to understand how to use light against the Wardens. If even a single beacon was left burning, it could cut a Warden in half. Aya realized this was not a fight for territory anymore. It was a fight to define the very condition of the battlefield. To save humanity, they would have to plunge humanity deeper into fear. The plan unfolded with grim efficiency. Wardens slipped into power plants that still sputtered faintly, tearing down systems with hands that could convince machinery to forget itself. They snapped cables, overturned generators, and whispered to the circuits until the last sparks guttered. Human workers who had clung to those systems for survival shouted in anger at first, demanding why the Wardens would destroy the last chance of restoring light. But when Kesh explained that the choice was simple, light and alien control or darkness and the chance of survival, their protests dimmed. Some cursed, some wept, but none raised a hand to stop him. Aya found herself at the edge of one of those encounters, speaking to a young man who had been guarding the flickering lamps of a subway hub, as if they were holy relics. She told him she understood. She told him she missed the light too. Then she told him she had seen what happened when the aliens used it. He stared at her in silence and then, with trembling fingers, turned off the last switch himself. The subway swallowed its glow and became invisible. As the dark deepened across the globe, the aliens reacted with fury. Their commander shouted orders that carried frustration more than strategy. Entire battalions were redirected to hunt the Wardens openly. They set up vast flood lamps that beamed from their ships like angry suns, tearing shadows from city blocks. But the Wardens had anticipated it. They lured squads into traps where the lamps were bait, drawing the aliens close enough to strike, then collapsing entire structures upon them. Var led one such assault, guiding a team of humans to plant explosives along the girders of an unfinished tower. As the aliens gathered around their brilliant beacon, believing they had secured territory, the tower folded in on itself like a broken spine. From the rubble, laughter echoed, not cruel but triumphant, the sound of prey becoming predator. I listened to it from blocks away and felt the surge of relief ripple through every hiding place. But victory was never without price. The aliens began deploying their bioweapons, monstrous creatures bred to prowl darkness where ordinary soldiers failed. Aya saw one with her own eyes near the river, a hulking figure that moved like a spider and a wolf fused together, its limbs jointed wrong but horrifyingly effective. It sniffed at the air, searching not with eyes but with senses that even the Wardens did not command. Lyra stood before it, trembling but steady, and unleashed a pouch of sand that blossomed into a storm of illusions. The beast lunged at phantom prey, snapping at shadows while Lyra pulled a group of children to safety. Aya stitched a gash across Lyra's back later that night, and realized how much blood a body could lose and still keep moving. Lyra said she was fine and smiled faintly, but her eyes betrayed exhaustion. The younger warden was carrying more weight than she should, but Aya knew there was no choice. Heroes were not chosen. They were cornered and then forced to act. The counselor who had betrayed them returned, forced into confession by the Wardens and spat on by the very people he claimed to serve. Yet his treachery could not be dismissed. He had given the aliens knowledge of Warden vulnerabilities, and those cracks now showed in battle. Several Wardens had been caught in nets of light that burned and bound at once. Aya had treated them, and knew that some scars would never heal. During one strategy council, the elder warden declared that betrayal was always more dangerous than open war. Var asked why the counselor was still alive. Aya answered before the elder could. Because if he lives, everyone sees what betrayal looks like. If he dies, the lesson disappears with him. Even Kesh, who hated politics, admitted she was right. The counselor sat in silence, forced to live with shame heavier than death. Dawn did not break so much as remember how. The sky at first was a bruise, purple and uncertain, and then a thin seam of gray appeared along the edge of the world as if someone had cut a careful line with a razor and light had begun to leak through. Aya sat with Lyra propped against the remnants of the pyramid that had once pulsed with false daylight. Var crouched nearby holding his side with a stubborn set to his jaw that told Aya he was worse off than he admitted. Kesh paced in a 3-step loop muttering that victory should come with chairs. Around them the city breathed in shaky little gasps, a massive creature coming back from drowning. People climbed out from makeshift trenches, from basements that smelled of damp and courage, from buses turned into barricades. They were filthy and exhausted and grinning in disbelief at the pale light growing on the horizon. No one wanted to say the word until they were sure it would not vanish if spoken. Aya finally said it because she had spent days saying the words no one else could, and if dawn was a diagnosis she would deliver it. Morning, she said simply, and the sound carried down the street and bounced off shattered walls like a stone skipping on a pond. Laughter followed, the kind that shakes out of a body without permission. A bus driver lifted his pipe like a trophy. The grocer tore the remains of a map and declared the streets were open for business even if nothing had a roof anymore. Even the utility workers grinned and promised to build wires out of string if they had to. For a handful of heartbeats it felt like the story could end there, a city waking up with a bruised face and a fierce heart. Then the sky answered back with a low angry rumble and everyone remembered the mothership waiting above the clouds like a lid pressed over a bowl. The fleet had lost its beacon but not its pride. Without the ground corps, the ships hesitated, unsure of coordinates, but they still had weapons enough to scar continents. The commander's rage found a path through that confusion. He ordered a saturation strike to scorch the city that had mocked him, to erase the dark that had taught his soldiers fear. Var closed his eyes as if the vibrations of that command were a drum he could hear. He said it would fall on them in minutes. People flinched and looked for holes to crawl into, as if a hole could hide them from the sky. Aya felt the old panic climb her spine, the temptation to run for cover, to pretend maybe the next second would put everything back the way it had been. She put a hand on Lyra and felt a heat like warm coals instead of a pulse. The young warden stirred and opened her eyes. In that moment Aya understood what the elder had meant when he said nothing and everything had changed. Lyra was no longer only a warden. Something in the engine had burned and remade her. Where the other wardens wore night-like clothing, she held both dark and the last embers of light as if they were twin threads and her fingers were the loom. She looked at the bruising sky and then at Var and Kesh. She said she could climb it. Kesh almost laughed, and then did not. Climb the sky, he repeated, and shook his head. Var looked at Aya. He asked if Lyra could survive another burning. Aya heard the unspoken math that had haunted every decision of the last days. She had no answer. She had a truth instead. Sometimes survival is a bridge you cross whether or not it is finished. Lyra stood, unsteady but upright, and every warden within sight turned toward her as if answering a command no mouth had spoken. The elder arrived with that silent timing that always felt like the world had bent to make room for him. He looked not at the sky but at the streets, at the humans gathering in clusters, at the scars etched into the stone and the people both. He told Var that this would be a choice made not by oath but by will. He said that if Lyra went, they would not pull her back unless she asked. He said that dawn had to be earned twice. Once by breaking the beacon. Once by teaching the mothership what the earth had learned. Var nodded. Kesh grinned a feral little grin and whispered that he always wanted a story where the hero literally took the stairs to heaven. Aya told Lyra she would be there when she returned, because promises are stitches and sometimes that is enough to keep the body together. They built the path the only way they knew how. Wardens climbed to rooftops and traced lines in the air with their hands, carving rungs out of shadow, each one catching and holding for a blink before dissolving. Humans formed circles in the streets below, palms up, eyes closed, adding the weight of their attention to each rung. Attention, the elder said, was a kind of gravity. Children who had learned to be quiet in the dark now whispered encouragement, as if those words could become a net. Lyra took the first step and the shadow held. She took the second and the third, and by the time she reached the 10th she was no longer climbing with her legs at all. She moved like a moth that had decided the flame was its brother instead of its death. Aya watched the little glow of Lyra rise, and she remembered nights in the hospital when she had stood over a patient whose heart had stopped, whispering keep going to the air because sometimes the air listens.